This podcast is brought to you in part by support from our partner, the Kalliopeia Foundation. Kalliopeia envisions a future grounded in compassion, respect, dignity, reverence for nature, and care for each other and the earth. Other organizations they support include the Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance and Lead to Life. To learn more about Kalliopeia's mission, visit kalliopeia.org.
Hey For the Wild community, Ayana here. In this week's episode, we'll be speaking with activist ELSA SEBASTIAN from Last Stands about the current threats facing the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska. Since we spoke, there have been a few key updates that I'd like to share before we begin. One of the largest threats at this time is Trump's plan to rescind the Roadless Rule in the Tongass and open 9.2 million acres of protected land back up to logging and resource extraction. Just yesterday, the Forest Service announced that on Friday, October 18th, they will finally publish the draft environmental impact statement for the Roadless Rule exemption being proposed. The release will open a 60-day period for public review and comment, and for those of us who are U.S. citizens, we have the right and responsibility to weigh in on this important decision that will determine the future of the Tongass, one of the most precious living libraries left on this earth. We'll share more at the end of this episode, so stay tuned, and in the meantime, visit our website at forthewild.world and learn how you can make a public comment. We will also continue to share updates and ways that you can take action on the podcast and across our social media channels. Now on to the show.
It is incredibly important that people engage with this comment process, especially as we're seeing the Trump administration work to try to weaken this type of process.
Today we are speaking with ELSA SEBASTIAN. ELSA grew up in the fishing village of Point Baker on northern Prince of Wales Island. For most of her 20s, ELSA captained a commercial salmon trawler, fishing the wild coastline of southeast Alaska. These days, ELSA deckhands on a driftgill netter in Bristol Bay and spends her winters working in conservation, most recently as executive director of Lynn Canal Conservation. ELSA loves wildlife and spent several years working with Alaska Whale Foundation to establish a remote field station on Baranof Island, now serving as chair of the Alaska Whale Foundation Board of Directors. ELSA founded the Last Stands Project in 2017 to learn more about what remains of the world's largest coastal temperate rainforest, the Tongass. Since founding the project, she's bushwhacked and beachwalked through hundreds of miles of forest and coastline and sailed to threatened last stands of old growth on her home island of Prince of Wales. ELSA is a 100-ton licensed captain and adventures from a 38-foot ketch sailboat, the Murelet. ELSA, this is so wonderful to speak with you today. I just admire you so much and really hold you in my heart often. So thank you for making the time to be on For the Wild podcast.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this for a few months now.
Yes, I know. I love how our meeting has collided and now we're finally both being able to speak, both in Alaska, although not together, which next year that will have to change at some point. So I'd like to ground our conversation today by giving our listeners some historical context and background information on Roadless Rule. Passed in 2001 by the Clinton administration, the Roadless Rule prohibits further road construction and timber harvest in inventoried roadless areas. Roughly 1/3 of all National Forest System lands, or approximately 58.5 million acres across the country. The rule is considered one of the country's most successful conservation measures, passing with tremendous public participation. Since its passing, however, the rule has faced a series of appeals and injunctions, lawsuits, and violations, and in Alaska, the rule currently faces renewed threats under the Trump administration's rollback of public lands conservation, the largest in American history, actually. So to jump in, why is Roadless Rule so important to uphold and protect? What is at stake in Alaska and in the 22 million acres of the Tongass and the Tongass National Forest that would be reopened to road development and logging?
Yeah, thank you so much for that history. That really does set it up well. So the Tongass is the largest forest in Alaska, and it's also the only forest where we really have an active timber industry. The Forest Service likes to say that this rule change is to try to improve access for rural communities in Alaska so we can have access to things like, hydropower. But actually, because this rule change is only impacting the Tongass, it's pretty obvious to see that this is about the timber industry. This is about opening up more acreage of old growth forest to be clear cut.
Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned the Tongass is our nation's largest forest. It's 17 million acres in southeast Alaska. It wraps around 11,000 miles of coastline and remains one of the most pristine and productive estuaries on the planet. Now, the Tongass is also home to one of the largest remaining areas of ancient old-growth temperate rainforest of cedar, spruce, and hemlock, just to name a few, some of these trees over 1,000 years old, as well as countless plant and wildlife species, including the endangered marbled murrelet, bald eagle, Sitka black-tailed deer, and 5 species of Pacific salmon. So I'd love if you could tell us more about the dynamic relationships and ecological threads that weave between these plant and animal communities. And why is it so critical that these habitats and wildlife corridors remain undeveloped and intact to support the web of life beyond the Tongass?
One of the things that this project has taught me is quite a bit about what is left in the Tongass and why it's important to protect what is left. The timber industry in the Tongass has been active at an industrial scale since the 50s. And since then, so many of the low-lying valleys and sort of easy pathways for animals have been cut. And so when I started this project, I had this idea that I was going to hike through threatened lands and I would only hike through old growth forest. What I found when I actually started planning my routes and getting out into the field is that the most obvious corridors for wildlife have often already been cut. So what that means is that the wildlife has to work harder to move between intact wild places and often has to use logging roads. And so the areas that are left unroaded are absolutely essential to provide connectivity for wild animals. And without it, we're going to see these unique island ecosystems degraded to a point where they will no longer have an intact ecological character. And so protecting these roadless areas is absolutely critical to ensure that the Tongass remains unfragmented in the places where it still expresses its most wild character.
I've experienced the roadless areas in the Tongass, and it's beyond explanation to me that we need to protect these roadless areas because roads are the beginning to the end for species, for intact ecosystems, and it became that much more clear just being on the ground here. Now, the history of land management and resistance to industrial extraction is a much longer story than the present-day debate over Roadless Rule. From one of your field journal entries, I recall that you spent your 10th birthday on an Amtrak train traveling with your family to Washington, D.C. to lobby for the inclusion of the Tongass in the Roadless Rule. So speaking from your experience growing up on Prince of Wales Island and immersed in this culture of activism from such a young age, could you give us a sense of the arc of resistance and the shifting stakes in the Tongass? How has this movement and your relationship to it as an organizer and advocate for this land changed through the years?
I think that this project and my advocacy within the last few years has had me thinking a lot about how people settle places and how their relationship changes with those places throughout generations. So my parents moved to Alaska in the 70s, and both of them were coming from essentially the suburbs. My dad grew up in Ohio and my mom was from Oakland. And they came to Alaska, and for them it was paradise. It was a place where there was wildness and abundance beyond what they ever imagined. So when they moved to Alaska and started a family, I think for them to watch the timber industry, which was really at its peak when they were starting their family, it was such an attack on what they had found. And this thing that they had found, as I said, was beyond what they could have ever imagined. And so their response to that violent attack was very passionate. And it really, in many ways, was what they needed to do and what felt necessary in that moment. But it wasn't informed by a long history on the land. So growing up in a family that was engaged in environmental activism, I was just aware of how divisive environmental conflict is in rural places, and how it tears people apart, the impact that it has on rural communities in terms of, really impacting friendships, impacting the potential for communities to grow and flourish, because there's just so much emotion that is ingrained in the conflict. And so as a second generation environmental activist, I feel that my journey has been a bit more complicated than that, but it's still a young journey. I think it'll take, generations of living in the Tongass to really be able to speak for it in an informed way. And so I hope that my future ancestors are able to carry this work forward. But when I grew up on Prince of Wales, the timber industry was very visible. I remember looking out the window from our log cabin living room and seeing, these huge ships just loaded with, freshly fallen trees moving by, headed to wherever. And as a child, like that was really hard to process what I was actually seeing. And I think I didn't really have the capacity to understand what was happening to the land that I was growing up on. As a child and for much of my life, the land really showed me beauty almost exclusively. And sometimes that beauty was woven in pretty fierce colors of the storms and the darkness and sort of the intensity of where the land meets the sea and the sharp edges of the coast. But I think most of all, the land took care of us, and it was just so abundant in that, in giving us the venison and the berries and the birdsong and the tranquility. And so I saw the forest as being abundant and beautiful. And the realities of what the timber industry, with all of the force of government subsidy behind it, was doing to my home island, and also, all of the rainforest islands in Southeast Alaska that have those big stands of trees. So I think in some ways for me, I started the Last Stands project when I was 27, and it really feels like a coming of age project. I think at a certain point, if you're going to live somewhere with dignity and intentionality, you just have to take the blinders off and see around you. And for me, when I first started this project, I had my huge backpack and I was going to hike across the last stands of untouched ancient old growth on Prince of Wales. And I started to look at the forest in a different way to actually understand what the human history of industrial extraction has been. And when I did that, I realized, for the first time, that the hillsides around my home were covered in scars, and those scars were old clear cuts. And even though those areas were green and looked recovered from the shore, when you look at an old clear cut, it's a green canopy. But what you don't understand when you see that green is that underneath that top layer of the top of the canopy, those old clear cuts are really like dead zones. There's no understory growth or life. And so I think that, as an activist, when I started this, it was, as a 10-year-old, I went back to Washington, D.C. to lobby for the Roadless Rule. At that time, my parents were just telling me to speak for the value of our lifestyle, because they recognized that our lifestyle was under attack. So I was just, speaking to these people who were making these decisions and trying to tell them as a 10-year-old, why I cared about salmon and why I liked, being able to play in the forest. But now as an adult, I think that I've finally come to a place where I can start to meet the forest with a more honest approach of seeing and understanding. And it's been, in some ways, sort of a painful transition because those realities are really hard to bear.
I was visualizing you as a young child playing in the forest and going to Washington, D.C., and I love hearing your stories, so thank you for sharing those personal pieces of your life with us. I was actually just looking for this quote that you once wrote, quote, "There are not anonymous lands. These are lands with long histories, rich webs of life, and value that extends far beyond stumpage," end quote. And I'm wondering, why have you chosen to tell the story of the Tongass in the way that you have, beyond traditional data and scientific methodologies, but instead through written word, drawings, photography, social media, and compelling narratives? And maybe a second part to that is, beyond the measurable scientific findings, it seems that so much of what you are trying to give voice to in this project cannot be captured or quantified in the data. So I also wonder how you share these important messages with the court's lobbyists or those who may not necessarily see value beyond the numbers.
Yeah, trying to figure out how to do that has been at the heart of this journey. And I think that's in part why this project continues for me. Whenever I have open space in my life, I feel myself drawn back to the forest and drawn back to this sort of intense interdisciplinary way of trying to experience a place. And it's interdisciplinary because of the people that I journey with. So I think that ground truthing for me is a way to engage with public lands as fully as we can and try to democratize the sort of information that is shared with the public about their lands. So the Tongass is held in common between all of us who are citizens of the United States. And for me, ground truthing is a way to bring a human and a non-expert perspective to the table. Spending time on the land gives somebody authority to speak for what is valuable there. And what I've found actually is that a lot of times the folks who are in management roles don't actually understand what is truly in the forest beyond the colors that they're looking at on the map. And we've actually had an experience with the Last Stands project where we talked to a ranger at a local Forest Service office about an area that we were planning to walk through. And we were concerned about that area because it did have a heavy past with timber extraction. And we knew that it was just going to be this, chopped up matrix of broken lands. And we wanted to find a path that would take us through some of the old growth that was left there. And this ranger, who is the local manager for the forest, pointed to areas on the map that were designated old growth reserve and told us that that's where the big trees would be. And so we went there and we had to walk on logging roads to get there. And when we got there, we realized that what he had sent us to were actually very old clear cuts. So clear cuts that had happened before the Forest Service started taking good notes, basically. So that was really interesting, just realizing that just because something is designated in a certain way on the map doesn't mean that that accepted reality is going to hold up when you're in the forest itself. So yeah, that idea of ground truthing as a citizen of this democracy to be in the land and to confirm whether or not what we've been told is true, which is a definition that I'm sort of pulling from Terry Tempest Williams and some of the work that she's done in the Arctic. I think that is a critical foundation of this project. I think what I've started to realize on a more personal level is that we need to have stories to explain the urgency of these issues. And we need to have stories that will fuel us as conservationists and keep us going even when the advocacy work feels futile. Stories can come from experiences that we create for ourselves. And I think that for many people in our generation, we're starting to realize that we live in a culture that is devoid of the sort of ritual that we need to find a more reverent relationship with nature. So, we have to sort of start out in this fledgling way to try to create our own rituals. And yet there's so much to pull from. And I think the idea of walking and pilgrimage is something that has been really inspiring for me on this project. I mean, it's the most ancient way to be in awareness of a landscape in a humble way. And if you do enough of it, you sort of find a rhythm. So for me, this moving through the dense rainforest, it really is bushwhacking. I mean, it's not like, we're moving in slow motion through, glorious stands of huge old trees. So much of it is just like crawling on hands and knees through, dense thickets of berry bushes and, pokey devil's club. But when you do it enough, you're really opening yourself up to joy as well. And there's so much that I'm still processing from this work, but I feel like this sort of joy that comes from spending a lot of time in a place that is threatened with the hope of protecting it is what motivates you to tell stories about the place and work for it, and I plan to work for these, stands of old growth for the rest of my life. And I know that I'll have to.
Stories are powerful, and they have been for us humans probably since the very beginning. And I don't think that data alone is going to support us in protecting these places. I think it's important to an extent to be able to ramble off, the carbon sequestration information, and that, of course, we're going through a massive extinction, and those things are important. But I'm really with you in the way that you see where the power lies to shift people's perspective.
Yeah, and that point of, data is a really good one. And I think we're in an interesting time because I feel that people who understand that things aren't going the way they should be, who, feel a hole in their hearts, are often told that, data is the sort of root of those problems. We're at a time where we're, questioning science. That's not what this project is about. We're absolutely not questioning science. I think what I'm trying to do and sort of find my way through it as a local advocate for these places is to just be a more whole and fierce defender by having connection to, each of these stands of forest that are threatened. And I think that, when you put yourself out there in that way, it makes the work a lot more painful. I'm fully anticipating that some of these areas that I've visited on Prince of Wales will be logged, not just within my lifetime, but within the next 10 years. And so when I hear about that, I'm going to be, imagining that gorgeous cedar tree that I stumbled upon after hours of thrashing around in thickets of berry bushes, stepping out and like coming to that gentle flowing creek and seeing this enormous tree that just holds so much space and so much silence. And, seeing around it the beds of deer and just the ways that, like, seeing through the forest, the ways that the animals and, the things that are living in the forest appreciate the presence of that tree. When that place is threatened, I am going to feel that so deeply. And I think that in some ways, that feels really scary. I mean, when you forge these personal connections with places, what you're doing is you're opening yourself up for heartbreak. But I also think that it allows me to speak in a more informed way about what's actually on the ground. And one of the environmental writers that resonates most with me is Wendell Berry. And I think the reason that I feel such a strong affinity for him is because he also is working to love a place that has been hit hard by industry. And when I say working, I really do mean that. I think that it takes effort to open yourself up to love places that have been hurt. So, some of the things that Wendell Berry is dealing with and thinking about as he writes and as he, finds an environmental ethic for Appalachia is the impact of industrial agriculture and coal mining and boom economies and the poverty that, follows in the wake of those booms. And where I'm from, Prince of Wales has also been hit hard by industrial extraction. And we're dealing with the same after effect of boom and bust industry. And that's why Prince of Wales is called the sacrifice zone. And it's interesting to relate this to Wendell Berry because he's writing about industrial agriculture. And that's a huge part of the problem for the Tongass and all forests within our national forest system is that they're being managed under the Department of Agriculture. The Forest Service is part of the Department of Agriculture. And so that's part of the reason why we're letting ancient forests that have been thousands of years in the growing to be managed as if they're crops of lettuce. So these foresters that are working within the system of management are experts, but they're experts in a sort of quantitative system that I think will always be deferential to the needs of the timber industry because the outputs of timber are easily measured and the successful managers of Southeast Alaska are the ones that are able to show the productivity of the land as it's measured through, millions of board feet of old growth trees. So the kind of value that a citizen of Southeast Alaska, someone that lives in the Tongass is trying to speak to, when they're pushing back against these policies is a lot harder to quantify. I mean, we're talking about, a lot of times we're talking about something that's more spiritual, and we're talking about our need for beauty. We're talking about our need to continue to live in a way that our parents have made for us. And in the case of many people in Southeast Alaska who are indigenous to the land, it's thousands of years of ancestors who have made that way. And that, unfortunately, is not something that expert culture is very good at. And I think that this project, the idea of ground truthing, is for me, at least, like a way to really strengthen my local knowledge and my love of this area that will continually be under attack by a management system that exists to quantify productivity of the land.
Confused who I miss most. The lights flicker and I'm looking at a ghost. The electricity still plays our records. In these dark hours our love is unprotected. Like the ocean waves pouring over my feet, it reaches my knees. And for a moment I am lost in
You had mentioned that Prince of Wales, where you grew up, is the sacrifice zone of the boom and bust of logging. It's also, I've read it being called ground zero for old growth logging. I think that was actually what drew me to go to Prince of Wales Island, was seeing that on I think it was an article title. And I'm just curious how this economic conflict plays out in your community of Prince of Wales. How did the logging boom through the second half of the 20th century not only drastically impact the forest and watershed ecosystems, but also sow the seeds of social division and cultural toxicity? And how do you go about navigating the complexity and tensions that are rooted in these issues as an advocate, an activist, and a neighbor?
Well, I feel often that I am well prepared to be an advocate for conservation in Southeast Alaska because of my relationship with salmon. I've spent every summer of my life working in the commercial salmon fishing industry in one way or the other. I grew up on my family's fishing boat, would spend 3 to 4 months of the year with my family on our tiny, 42-foot wooden fishing boat, catching salmon and, making our livelihood. And in my early 20s, I started running my own boat and fishing solo. And I did that for about 5 years. And I think that was really important work for me and continues to be, because I understand how you can have a really powerful and meaningful relationship with a creature or a living thing that you're taking the life from. And I also understand how significant that sort of work is to maintaining connections between family. It's an important thing in my family that I'm still a fisherman, because I can call my parents and ask them how their fishing season is going. And we can have like a really vital back and forth about the work that we do. And that's an important thing to me. But what I've started to realize is that, the story of commercial fishing in Southeast Alaska and of logging are really actually close. When the commercial fishing industry started in Southeast Alaska, people used to catch these, big 100-pound king salmon, like pretty frequently. And I've never even seen a fish that big. The size of those big king salmon has, been gradually declining over the last 80 years. And the big fish that my father caught when he first started fishing here are, twice the size of the big fish that I catch now. And I think that there's sadness in watching that sort of change. And it feels really basic to want to try to hold things as they are, to not want to accept that reality that, humans have had an impact. The reason why there aren't those big fish anymore is because that genetic line has been removed, in large part because of commercial fishermen. And of course, commercial salmon fishing is a lot different than logging old growth trees, because these big trees that were falling are, sometimes, 500, 600, 700, even, 1,000 years old. So that cycle of return is a very long one, and it's really hard to correct the wrong that has been done. But I guess what I feel is important to me as a conservationist, and what allows me to work in communities without feeling too much anger, is recognizing that these sort of industries are often the way that people are finding their identity and finding their connection to their family. And a lot of communities on Prince of Wales were founded, white settler communities were founded on the timber industry. And those communities are dying out because, for one, they were never built with the sort of stability or care that most communities are. I mean, they were boomtowns. People came because there were jobs. And some of those people really fell in love with the lifestyle and wanted to stay. So coming to realize that, and realizing the commonality that I have with those people who are working in the timber industry is definitely, it's one of the painful parts of this work. I think as a second generation advocate for the Tongass, it's not natural for me to demonize the other side. What is wrong is that very few people are actually making money off of falling these ancient trees. What is wrong is that when we clear cut forests and send, 50 to 80% of those trees overseas, we're stripping the land that we live on of its value. And we're doing that for the next 200 years because an old growth forest won't be able to carve out its, vital existence on those lands for at least another 200 years. When I advocate for stopping the timber industry at an industrial scale, I'm doing that in part because I want to see people continue to live on Prince of Wales and continue to have the opportunity to have relationship with big old trees. And sometimes that relationship, involves taking the life of that tree and using it for something. And, from like an economic perspective, those big old growth trees are like money in the bank for local communities. But we can't just think about them in terms of their immediate economic value, because that is stripping land of its abundance and its, potential to support future generations. And actually being able to communicate that in an effective way and a way that can make a difference with policy is very challenging, especially now when we're in a time where we're seeing the NEPA process being undermined. People are being removed from management decisions, and they're being removed so a very few can make a quick buck. That's pretty tragic, and I don't think that's what anybody wants in Southeast Alaska.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing some of the complexities with us and how you have come to find a type of reckoning with this really painful issue in your home. And I so appreciate the work that you have done on yourself, and perhaps the salmon in the forest have done on you, to be able to hold the complexity so gracefully. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the economic issues surrounding this old growth logging. And in January 2018, just to give some context, the state of Alaska sent a petition to the USDA requesting that these areas be exempt from the Roadless Rule. And since then, they have jointly signed a memorandum of understanding announcing their intention to create an Alaska state-specific version of the rule that would reopen to logging and road building. Based on my research for this episode, it seems that the state and logging industry's opposition to the rule is largely mounted on this economic claim that road construction, further development, and resource extraction is economically beneficial to Alaskans. So as somebody who works in the fishing industry, like you've told us, if you could paint a more comprehensive picture for us of these many economic issues at play in the debate around the rule, I just want you to speak to those people who say, but what about jobs? What about the economy? We need this. Or people from the outside who think that they should support this exemption to the Roadless Rule because they believe that it's actually going to be supporting people.
Yeah. The economic rationale for the timber industry in Southeast Alaska is incredibly frustrating to have to continually address because, the timber industry in Southeast Alaska has feasted off of subsidies, for pretty much since its industrial formation. And in reality, tourism and commercial fishing provides about 25% of the jobs in Southeast Alaska, and logging provides less than 1%. And so the numbers are there, tourism and commercial fishing, those industries are reliant on the Tongass to be this beautiful, incredibly rich place, not just visually, but, down to the watersheds as well that support salmon that commercial fishermen are absolutely reliant on. But that's not really where the argument is at, really. As we were talking about before, I mean, this really is a cultural thing. There's a few people in Southeast Alaska who are making a lot of money off the timber industry, and they're able to sort of play that cultural card to influence politicians who want to work to support their livelihood. But what's really sad is that the timber industry, as it is, has a very short future. So Prince of Wales, where I'm from, has the last mill that is cutting trees on an industrial scale in Southeast. And so that means that a lot of the policy changes that are put forward to try to encourage growth in the timber industry in Southeast Alaska are done almost exclusively for the benefit of that one mill. That mill employs about 40 people. So when the Forest Service and the Trump administration and the state of Alaska continue to manage the Tongass National Forest for clear-cut logging, they are justifying that decision based on the fact that there is a mill that is still doing that logging and operating locally. The sort of depressing side of that, and the reason why there's urgency, I think, in this moment, is that mill, Viking Mill, refuses to transition to a second growth industry. So a second growth industry would be an industry where they were cutting trees that have grown up on the scars of clear cuts from, the past 50 years. They refuse to do that. Their machinery is so big that it can only process old growth trees. And when that mill shuts down, the family that's running the mill, they'll be fine. The folks who won't be fine are, those 40 workers, which that's how many workers Viking claim work at their mill. But in fact, there's probably only another, maybe 15 years of old growth timber left on Prince of Wales. And if we open up these roadless areas, maybe there's more. But we're really looking at this mill shutting down within most likely the next 10 or 20 years, because there just aren't enough old growth trees left to make the industry profitable for a mill that's operating at that size. And so it really comes down to now. Will we make the decision to actually gracefully transition the Tongass away from clear-cut logging? Will we take care of the people who work at that mill and provide them other jobs? Or will we just let this go as every other boom and bust community will go if it's allowed? Take the last of what stands. People lose their jobs. They leave town because there's nothing left. And if we allow, Viking Mill to continue to cut trees on Prince of Wales, there will be nothing left, because the forest is an essential part of the reason why people live on Prince of Wales. It provides us with venison. Sitka black-tailed deer are essential to people who live a subsistence lifestyle, and most people do. It provides us with the sort of watersheds that can support the return of salmon. And it also supplies us with what is arguably still the most abundant opportunity in Southeast Alaska, which is these big, beautiful trees that we can make refined products out of, that we can build economies around. The question is whether or not those economies are going to be economies that can be, tended and passed through generations, or whether they're just going to be a boom and bust economy that takes what it can get, takes the money, and then leaves. And so the economic argument that the timber industry utilizes is so incredibly weak. The only reason why this industry exists is because of government subsidies. It is so expensive to cut trees in Southeast Alaska. A mile of road runs about $180,000. That money is given to the timber industry by the U.S. Forest Service. They literally take that off the price tag of these timber sales because they, somehow justify that it will provide future economic opportunity to these places. So the timber industry is able to operate because of those subsidies. And that's the reason why we have like 2,500 miles of logging roads on an island that's only 135 miles long. And when the only mill that's operating on the island has made it abundantly clear that as soon as the old growth is gone, they're going to pack up shop and retreat down to their parent corporation in Washington, it's obvious to the people who live there, who want to live there, who want to see there continue to be vital communities, that, you know, the U.S. Forest Service's justification for providing subsidies for logging roads is a lie. If there's no timber industry present that wants to harvest second growth, then those roads that, you know, we've been paying to build are a one-off. They're a one-off for very few people who are making profit off of this beautiful rainforest that is held in common by the people of the United States. God damn it. And beyond that, I look around in the commercial fishing industry and I see that the young people who are investing in the industry are doing it in an incredibly thoughtful way. You know, they've recognized that no longer do we live in a time where there's just raw abundance. There's more people living in the Tongass National Forest than there ever have been. And, you know, we're pretty hungry for resources. So the populations of wild salmon aren't what they used to be. And I see, you know, young fishermen responding to that in a really smart way, which is this realization that this action of structuring their business so they're able to catch less and make more money off of it. And that means that they're, you know, creating value added products. You know, they're putting it in a jar, they're, you know, filleting it themselves and creating direct markets that make sense for them. I think that it's 79% of the salmon that are harvested commercially in Southeast Alaska are coming from streams on the Tongass. Those salmon are reliant on those big old growth trees to hold that together. And also tourism is significant. People want to visit this place because it has a sort of raw beauty. It has in this, you know, this lushness, this life. It has so many things living in it. It has the hugest bears. It has, you know, humpback whales. The connection between land and sea is visible, and you can experience it even if you only are, you know, coming in and staying for a few days or a week. And so those two industries that are so valuable and are reliant on the Tongass make up 25% of the economic resource in Southeast Alaska, and the timber industry is less than 1%.
I've been to Pensacola, but never to Rome. I've walked the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. I always like the bay over the ocean side. The calmer water seemed more inviting. But maybe that was because it was long ago, and now I've grown old and more practical. The islands are calling, the islands are calling. I'm flying in, drinking champagne. All this pleasurable You've got to go home. You've got to go home.
I really want to focus now back on the Roadless Rule. And over the years, allied government and corporate entities have chipped away at the integrity of legislation and protections for the Tongass, largely by disregarding or barring public input and denying citizens their right to information. The Forest Service is opening up a period for public input this summer, or potentially in the next few weeks even, on Alaska state-specific rulemaking. But this commentary period will likely come during the busiest fishing season, guiding season, or at the end of it, if it's coming in a couple weeks, which essentially obstructs due process and citizen input, particularly from those who make a living from the state's natural resources, thus most impacted by the ruling, which is just crazy making to know that. Now, public participation was instrumental in the passing of Roadless Rule back in 2001, with more than 600 public hearings around the nation, 1.6 million public comments, and 95% supporting strong roadless protection. So what, if anything, has changed in this case? Has there been maybe less public participation and consensus around this issue, or has the opposition put more barriers in place to try and force through this legislation? And maybe also speak to just the importance of making the comment when it does open, potentially in a few weeks.
Yeah, so the Roadless Rule was very popular when the Clinton administration started to plan it and heard from the people and was able to finalize the rule in 2001. And the state of Alaska has pushed back on the rule since the beginning, because of this sort of adherence to the timber industry and the will of the timber industry, even as that industry is becoming such a small part of our economy. And last fall, when the U.S. Forest Service was scoping this rule change, and they were traveling to communities in Southeast Alaska, which is quite the undertaking. A lot of communities are very remote. And so it's an effort to travel to these communities and to hear from people. In almost every community, the opposition to the rule change was almost complete. For instance, in Sitka, 100% of the people that came and spoke at the Forest Service hearing were opposed to the rule change. Even on Prince of Wales, where, as I've mentioned, the timber industry does still exist in an industrial scale, people were largely opposed to the rule change. And I've never seen this kind of cohesion among communities in Southeast Alaska, which are all very diverse. The Roadless Rule is working for Southeast Alaska. The people in Southeast Alaska want to see it stay in effect. But it is frustrating that the Forest Service has originally been trying to release the draft environmental impact statement with their select plan for shifting the role of the Roadless Rule in the Tongass and opening up new lands to clear-cut logging. For whatever reason, we've seen a delay in the Forest Service process. And as far as I know, the public hasn't heard anything about the reason for this delay, but the Forest Service hasn't yet released their draft environmental impact statement. So we don't know what lands are threatened, and we don't know the scale of this change. But they will be releasing this in the next few weeks, and the public will have an opportunity to comment. And it is incredibly important that people engage with this comment process, especially as we're seeing the Trump administration work to try to weaken this type of process across the board through their proposed changes to the NEPA public process. One of the things I think about a lot is how people who live outside of Alaska and maybe who have never been to the Tongass, how they might, find a way to take the time to engage in this issue. And I think if it was me, if I was living somewhere far away and didn't really know much about the Tongass, I would want to know where the locals stand on this issue. What do the local people feel? So, Ayana, I really hope that your listeners will take the time to engage with this process. And I hope that they will submit comments to encourage the Forest Service, the Department of Agriculture, to select the no action alternative, which would mean that the Tongass would remain protected under the Roadless Rule. And when I think about what might motivate your listeners to do this, I think it's important for them to know that during the scoping process, there were, I think, about 143,000 comments that were submitted, and about 90% of those comments were in favor of not changing the Roadless Rule, of leaving the Roadless Rule acting on the Tongass, of continuing to protect these last stands of old growth. And so the people who care about the Tongass want to see this rule in place. And almost everybody that was engaged with the public scoping meetings in local communities in Southeast Alaska came out to say that this rule is working. This rule is working for the Tongass. It has minimized conflict in our communities. It has ensured, that wildlife have safe corridors, and that we have the sort of resilience in our natural systems that we need to continue to live our way of life in the Tongass. And so local people, for the most part, are in support of the Roadless Rule for the Tongass and do not want to see this change. And the second thing that I think might be really important to your listeners is something that I mentioned earlier. The Tongass is a huge sink for carbon emissions, and it sequesters 8% of the United States carbon. And that's part of the climate change solution, is ensuring that these forests that are standing, that are doing what they do, the lungs of our planet, aren't cut down. And, with the Sunrise Movement, I'm really encouraged to see what is coming of that, and, people working really hard and doing the organizing work necessary to determine what these climate change solutions are. And I think it's really important that we remember to do what is easy, which is, stop subsidizing an industry that is stripping us of our existing carbon reserves. So I hope that those two things can motivate your listeners to submit a public comment. And, public comments can be really intimidating. And that's another part of this project for me, is part of the work that I'm doing in the Tongass. I feel like that there's so much deference given to the way we quantify these issues, and, the statistics and the numbers, and that's all important, but that's all information that is held by decision makers already. That's information that they should be referencing when they're making their decisions, and they're not. The numbers line up in favor of protecting the Tongass. And so what is important for the Forest Service to hear is that the people of the United States want to see this forest valued for the right reasons, as a carbon sink, as a refuge for wildlife. So when I try to encourage people to write public comments, I ask them to, imagine the rainforest and imagine the wildlife and all of the connections of life within that forest, and just let yourself write a love letter. And at the end of that love letter, or at the beginning, maybe it's best at the beginning and the end, say that you support the no action alternative for the Tongass. You want to see the Roadless Rule remain in effect on the Tongass. And that's all that you need to do.
Everything that you've been saying has been nectar to my soul, and I respect you so much, Elsa, and I'm behind you, and I feel really fulfilled that we got to spend this time together, and I was able to learn even more about your passion and fierce devotion to this place. The last thing I was just going to ask is there anything that we haven't covered, or is there anything that you want to leave the audience with, whether that's website information, how to get a hold of you, or just any last statements that you want to make sure that you share at this time?
One thing that has been important to me in learning how to be a strong advocate for the Tongass, I'm working to become as strong of an advocate as I can be with all of who I am and all of who I'm not. But as we think about the work that we do for the environment and for conservation, I think it's really important not to be afraid of places that have been scarred deeply by histories of extraction. And sometimes working to protect these areas can be deeply painful because it forces us to contend with our roots, with our histories, with the reasons why we've come to live in the places that we live in. Our history as a nation is not a pretty one. And what I have learned through this project and what I have learned through this pilgrimage, which I really feel like it's been a pilgrimage. I've walked through so many lands on Prince of Wales, and some of them are beautiful stands of big cedar trees. And some of them are, totally ravaged, recently clear-cut places where the dynamite is still going off, like there's still roads being built and it feels like we're at war with the earth. And then even worse than that, moving through a 50-year-old clear cut where even though it's green on the top, even though the canopy is green, the trees that are supporting that canopy are so tight together. There's no diversity of size or age. And so they're choking each other out, and you move through those areas and they're just dead. Those landscapes are hard to move through. And I think that it becomes challenging to know how to advocate for those areas. But as you learn to advocate for areas, not because they're perfect, not because they're pristine, but because they're essential to life, it becomes easier to be a better friend to yourself and to the imperfections within yourself. And that's been part of my journey with this. And it's certainly being in the position of speaking for this place that I'm from, for Prince of Wales and for the Tongass to large audiences of people is not a position that I'm necessarily comfortable in. I grew up in the woods. I grew up in a village of 30 people. I was homeschooled. I've had a stutter for, over half of my life. And I continue to have a stutter. I am much happier in solitude. It is not easy for me to speak out. And I think it's, my connection with the natural world that has left me as a quiet person. I think that the forest inspires humility and it inspires slowness. And those are things that we can't always find, often aren't present with advocacy work. We're expected to speak loudly. We're expected to speak with authority. It's too often urgent, and we have to act faster than we feel like we're capable of. But I think it's these kind of journeys that offer us meaning. And so, when folks are thinking about how to advocate for the Tongass and how to advocate for the places that they're from and for yourself, I want to encourage those who feel inspiration in these words to look to the areas where beauty is having to fight really hard. And yeah, it's really wonderful to be part of your community. And thank you, Ayana. And I will just follow that by encouraging folks, if they're interested in my project. My ground truthing project is online. We have a website, www.laststands.org. On that website, there'll be some resources if you want to learn more about the Roadless Rule. There's also some blog posts about our journey through the Tongass, and I'll be adding some more here shortly. And we share photos through Instagram, although social media is not always a place where I'm super comfortable or confident. I really enjoy being able to show people who are part of the Tongass as, citizens of the United States. I enjoy being able to show them these lands that we hold together. So please check that out. And the other thing, that there are a lot of conservation groups that are doing really powerful work to protect the Tongass. One of the Last Stands adventurers, Natalie Dawson, has been involved with the project since the beginning, and she's the executive director of Audubon Alaska now. She just stepped into that role a few months ago. And I know that Natalie is doing really powerful work through that group. So check out Audubon Alaska, and also Southeast Alaska Conservation Council has published on their website something that they're calling the Roadless Rule Toolkit. And that toolkit offers different ways for folks who are concerned about this rule change to engage. So that's a really great resource and might be helpful to your listeners. I hope that your listeners can also look forward to a film that I'm working on with Wild Confluence Media, and that film is scheduled to come out probably in March. So we're hoping to get that on the road next spring.
As Elsa spoke about, one of the largest threats facing the Tongass at this time is Trump's plan to rescind the Roadless Rule and open 9.2 million acres of protected land back up to logging and resource extraction. We have a 60-day window to make our voices heard and send in our public comments. The time is now to take action and stand up for the future of the Tongass. First, we urge you to send in your public comment as soon as possible. You can do so today through Southeast Alaska Conservation Council or SEAC's online portal. Their plan is to flood the U.S. Forest Service on Saturday, October 19th, as soon as the comment period opens, with all of the comments that they have collected so far. Thereafter, every comment made through their website will go directly to the U.S. Forest Service. The deadline is December 17th, 2019 at midnight Alaska time. Visit seacc.org or our website forthewild.world to find the full link. Second, please consider making a donation to Last Stand's fundraising campaign and support the team in bringing stories of the Tongass to life through their beautiful art and film projects. Visit GoFundMe and search Tongass Last Stands. To stay up to date and informed about issues in the Tongass, check out the following organizations and follow them on social media: Audubon Alaska, Southeast Alaska Conservation Council, Sitka Conservation Society, Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and Earth Justice. Lastly, one of the most important things you can do is spread the word and share this information and episode with your friends, families, neighbors, anyone who cares about the future of our public lands. We'll need as many people as possible to step up and stop this legislation from passing. As always, you can visit our website at forthewild.world or click on the details tab of this episode for links and more information.
Thank you for listening to another episode of For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was from Aaron Durant. I'd like to thank our magical team, Aidan McRae, Andrew Storrs, Carter Lou McElroy, Erica Eckram, Aaron Wise, Francesca Glassbell, Hannah Wilton, Melanie Younger, and Suzanne Dollywall.